Hi there, students. This is Luis Silva. I am your social studies teacher, and today we're going to be looking at the Cold War, a very important topic in world history as well as United States history. This particular time period went from 1945 to 1991, and the objectives for this lesson are the following. First, what was the Cold War? Secondly, some background information into the Cold War, including the Yalta Conference and the defeat of Germany and Japan. Thirdly, we're going to be looking at the policies of containment. And lastly, the fall of China to communism. But what was the Cold War? This was a period in history in which the United States and the Soviet Union were like almost fighting each other using nuclear weapons. But fortunately, this actually never happened, and both nations never got to display any of their nuclear weapons and used it against each other. So that was a good thing. After the Second War, both nations, the United States as well as the Soviet Union, literally spent billions of dollars in creating new weapons of mass destruction. Obviously, the United States already had created the A-bomb, the atomic bomb that was used in Japan. Now, the Soviet Union also wanted to create atomic weapons, very powerful weapons that could literally kill hundreds of thousands of people. Now, the Soviets, the Russians, they created an atomic bomb right after the United States had actually used the first atomic weapons on another nation. And in 1961, the Soviets put on a massive display as they exploded one of their most powerful atomic weapons at that time. The atomic weapon was 58 megatons of TNT, and literally this bomb had the potential of killing, again, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. As you will see on the following video clip, it's an extremely powerful bomb that could potentially kill so many people and create chaos in the world. I hope you like it, and I'll see you on the other side. Now, if you can see here in this graphic that I'm showing you, and I need you to take your time, obviously, you can pause this video. You can see the main differences and up to a certain degree similarities between capitalism and communism. I'm not going to go over this stuff, but you can actually pause the video and review it. It would help you a lot. But what was the Yalta Conference? The Yalta Conference was a meeting that took place during World War II, 1945, in which Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt met in Yalta, in the Crimean Peninsula. And this was an important meeting because it set up the stage for the end of World War II. And some agreements were actually developed, and some of them were implemented. Some of the agreements included Germany would be divided into 4 blocks. The USSR would join the United Nations, but each member of the Security Council would have veto power. The USSR would join the Allies in defeating Japan, and the USSR took back lands that they lost during World War I. So it's fairly straightforward. Unfortunately, it didn't work this way for the most part. This is a map which you can see. The image to the left is Germany, and you see how Germany was actually divided. Now, if you see, again, we're looking at the map the image on the left hand side. The top right is basically excuse me, red, and within that red you have a dot which has different colors. I would say, or a little space which has different colors. That little space right there is actually Berlin, the capital of Germany. So if you can see, Berlin, the capital of Germany, is actually inside the area that was controlled by the USSR. This is an image of the three big leaders of the world, the three people that made it happen for Germany to fall and obviously Japan to surrender. You have on the left Winston Churchill. On the middle you have Franklin D. Roosevelt, which seems pretty old at this point and severely beaten up with all of these pressures of the war. And to the right you have Mr. Joseph Stalin. This is an image, newspaper, the New York Times, portraying this famous meeting and showing the world the importance of these three people meeting and discussing what was going to happen after the end of the Second War. All right, after this meeting, one of the biggest events that took place was victory in Europe. This was a significant moment in world history because Germany was actually defeated. Hitler committed suicide, and on May 8th, 1945, victory in Europe Day came, and most of Europe was extremely happy because they were tired and devastated by so many casualties, so much uncertainty. And you can see some images here of celebrations going on. The reality behind this war is that it took the lives of millions of people, soldiers as well as civilians. So people were extremely tired and they needed, obviously, to hear that this war was over. So again, May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered and Europe was freed from this massive oppression, at least up to that point, of the Germans. Now, the Potsdam Conference on July 17, 1945, leaders agreed to the direction of post-war Germany, and all dedicated to the unconditional surrender of Japan. So this conference laid out, after German surrender, like the foundation for how the world was going to continue to move on, and it called for Japan to surrender. Now, Victory Day in the Pacific side of the world, in this case, Japan actually surrendering. Well, it took some horrible things, I would say, to happen in order for Japan to finally surrender. And those horrible events were actually the US dropping 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki. The devastation forced Japan to surrender on September 2nd, 1945. And some of the images that you see here actually illustrate this massive explosion caused by the dropping of these atomic bombs. The image to the left is actually the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and the image that will come up right now, it's the bomb falling on Nagasaki. So here you go. You have 2 massive explosions that killed literally tens of thousands of people, which was a very sad situation. Unfortunately, as many people have claimed, that this was necessary in order to prevent the death of hundreds of thousands of US soldiers trying to invade Japan and actually defeated by invading it. But instead, the US decided to drop these 2 atomic bombs, and this actually brought the end of the war. So some facts about the atomic bombs are, first of all, they were developed basically in the Manhattan Project, which was a government program headed by J. Robert Oppenheimer. The 2 bombs were known as, one, Little Boy, and the second one, Fat Boy. To the left, you see Little Boy. To the right, you see Fat Man. very important weapons that were used to make Japan surrender. Some more facts about this bomb is that the plane that dropped the first bomb, in this case Little Boy, was named Enola Gay. The bombs killed over 200,000 people on or just after the days of the explosion. So this brought literally Japan to its knees, and they had no other option but to surrender. Now, in 1946, Mr. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, the USSR, or as we know today, Russia, gave a speech. And in that particular speech, he actually said that communism and capitalism were compatible. In other words, they couldn't work together. They couldn't coexist together. And he said that war was inevitable. And this is something really important, because here you see a separation of the USSR that was part of the victorious nations and was helped big time by the United States militarily in order to defeat Adolf Hitler. But in 1946, he said that communism and capitalism could not coexist together, and therefore war was inevitable. And his focus was now on building weapons instead of consumer goods. Now, in 1946, March 5th, Winston Churchill, he saw the threat of the Soviet Union. He saw the threat of Joseph Stalin. So what he said was that an iron curtain had actually fallen, descended across the continent of Europe. And up to a certain degree, he was right, because Joseph Stalin was depriving those nations that he ran over after, or actually not after, but during the Second War. Those nations that his soldiers walked through to get to Germany were under his control. And he did not allow those nations, like he promised, to have free elections, but instead he made those nations become communist. And that was a big problem. You have a political cartoon that came right after Roosevelt gave his speech, in which, if you see here, there is the Iron Curtain that had fallen on Europe, and the eastern countries of Europe. And Mr. Churchill was telling the world that something was going on that was very wrong within those nations. And of course, those nations were actually deprived of many rights. Those nations were deprived of many freedoms by Joseph Stalin. Here you have a map, and if you see that those red, or that red line, that is what Mr. Churchill referred to as the Iron Curtain. Those nations, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, those nations were under the control of the Soviet Union, and they could not have free elections, but instead they had to adopt communist governments. So this is what Winston Churchill was referring to. Now, the United States was not happy about this expansion of control, dominion over Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union. So the United States came up with a group of policies that tried to prevent this. And one of the first policies that the United States implemented was the Truman Doctrine in 1947. This was initially a plan designed to make it less likely for communists to take control of Greece and Turkey. Greece was going through some internal conflicts, and Russia was meddling in there and, kind of supporting the opposite side. So the U.S. we're not going to let Russia take over Turkey, and we're not going to let Russia take over Greece. So therefore, we're going to give them money to protect themselves. In this case, the U.S. gave about $400 million to support the economies and militaries of Turkey and Greece. So this was like the first big step of the United States trying to prevent the spread of communism. Now, the Truman offered support to anyone who wanted to resist communism. And here you go, you have what became known as obviously the Truman Doctrine, which was to provide aid to the Greeks and to Turkey. The second policy that the United States came and implemented in Europe is what we know as the Marshall Plan. This was a plan designed to help all of Europe rebuild from the war. Stalin was offered also help, but he actually turned it down. He actually believed that the United States was trying to get in so deep on European affairs and Russian affairs, or in this case USSR affair, that he said, no, we're not going to take your money. And the US offered, in this case, or gave $13 billion to 16 European countries. Some of those European countries took the money, obviously, and those Eastern European countries that were under the influence or on the other side of the Iron Curtain to the east, they were not able to take money. In here you see some of those nations that benefited from the money the U.S. was giving, including obviously the United Kingdom, France, and Italy, and many other nations took a whole bunch of money, and this helped them to rebuild their countries, their economies, their agricultural output, to feed the people. So it was a good way for the United States to prevent the spread of communism. Now, another very important agreement that was put in place or set in motion on September 2nd, 1947 was the Rio Pact. This was a pact that came, that was actually signed in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And the principle of this pact or agreement was that an attack on one was considered an attack on all of them. So again, the United States is putting this coalition together in order to prevent the spread of communism. And if in any case, let's say any of those nations, including the United States, was attacked by anybody related to the USSR or the Soviet Union, all of those nations would join together to defend each other. Another, or a very important event that took place from 1948 to 1949 was the Berlin Blockade. The Berlin Blockade was an attempt in 1948 by the Soviet Union to limit the ability of the United States, Great Britain, and France to travel to their sectors of Berlin, which lay within Russian-occupied East Germany. This was a problem, as you saw on the map, that Berlin was actually in the middle of the area that was controlled by the Soviet Union. So this was a big problem. In June 1948, the simmering tensions between the Soviet Union and its former allies in World War II exploded into a full-blown crisis in the city of Berlin. Alarmed by the new U.S. policy of giving economic aid to Germany and other struggling European nations, as well as efforts by the Western allies to introduce a single currency to the zones they occupied in Germany and Berlin, the Soviet blocked all rail, road, and canals access to western zones of Berlin. Now, suddenly, some 2.5 million civilians had no access to food, medicine, fuel, electricity, and other basic goods. This obviously angered the United States, Great Britain, and France, as they were not able to provide the means, for example, like food or necessary supplies for those people to survive. Now, again, some of the causes, it's that obviously the United States was well, I see the point in this case of Joseph Stalin and being angry as the U.S. was trying to influence the entire region, and therefore he blocked every road, every railroad, every canal that led to Berlin. And this obviously created a big tension, a tension that many people believed and thought was going to lead to World War III, especially with the United States having these nuclear weapons. Now, it's really important because the world, right after ending this big World War II conflict, was almost getting into another big conflict that, was going to be, in this case, the United States versus the Soviet Union, the United States with nuclear weapons, and it was going to create chaos all over the world. And again, you see here, you see this map. This is the map to the left. You see the areas that were controlled by the different countries, including the United States, Great Britain, and France, and the area that was controlled, which is highlighted in red, which was controlled by the Soviets. And within that red zone controlled by the Soviets, you had Berlin, which was also divided into 4 sections. So this was a big conflict that almost brought World War III and the death of millions of people. You see images here of airplanes, dropping off materials, food, water. And this is something for you to see, a visual. And you see, like, on the picture to the or the 2 upper pictures to the right, you see like food supplies. So the people of Germany, or Berlin in this case, were very happy because the Allies did not let them down, and they had at least the basic necessities to survive that time period. Now, moving on, the United States decided that it could not be by itself, and it had to build a coalition of powerful nations. So in this case, the United States formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or as we know it today, NATO. And this was an alliance of nations in order to deter the Soviets from doing anything, from attacking anybody. So the original purpose of NATO was to protect its members from possible attacks from the Soviet Union. And again, this is part of containment. And this was an alliance of nations that said the same thing as the Rio Pact, that, hey, if anybody attacks you, then we'll go ahead and defend you. And obviously, the Soviet Union was not very happy about this. Finally, we have one of the most tragic events in after the First or the Second War, and this was the fall of China to communism. This was seen as a disaster for U.S. foreign policy, because the United States was trying to prevent any nation from falling into communism. And in this case, unfortunately, China was the first nation, in this case a big nation, to fall to communism. But the roots of this conflict here went back all the way to the 1920s, in which the nationalists were fighting the communists since the 1920s. They only stopped, obviously, for some time during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and obviously they stopped during the Second War. But as soon as the war was over, the Second War was over, they started to fight again. And in 1949, the Chinese government actually fell to communism, and China became communist. In October 1949, communists set up the People's Republic of China, and in the early 1950s, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union signed a treaty of friendship and alliance. So both nations, China and the USSR, were aligned, and both were communist nations. Now, this is the end of this presentation, but it's the beginning, basically, of the Cold War. So I invite you to continue to watch these presentations. We'll come up with part 2 very soon, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And also make sure that you subscribe to this channel in order to continue watching history videos that relate to United States history, world history. So stay within this channel, and we're gonna get you a whole bunch of materials that will get you to be a successful student in both classes, world history and US history. And I will talk to you guys very soon.